In a prior video, I had discussed the material and resource advantage of the North over the South, and it was drastic. One of the other advantages that the South had over the North, though, wasn't just fighting on its home territory, the familiarity with land, and a culture that was more adept to the outdoors, but also leadership. You see, the President of the United States at the time was Abraham Lincoln, who he himself was an effective commander in chief. He had a problem, though, of leadership within his militaries. So, Winfield Scott had been a Mexican war hero. By the time the Civil War rolled around, he was already in his 70s and he was incapable physically of actually going out into the field. George McClellan was a little too cautious for Lincoln's take, and Lincoln suffered under the idea that his generals were not ruthless enough when dealing with Confederates. It wasn't until 1864 when Abraham Lincoln appointed Ulysses S. Grant, one of his commanders out in the Western Front, to the overall command of Union troops. So, the United States military and the Union forces had a leadership disadvantage. So they had resource advantage, but in the early years of the war, they were reasonably ineffectual because they were not organized and led very well. Conversely, Jeff Davis, the president of the Confederacy, named Robert E. Lee the overall commander of Confederate forces. A few notes about Robert E. Lee. He's from Virginia. He actually attended the United States Military Academy at West Point. He's a West Point grad. He is West Point trained. He had leadership that was widely regarded in U.S. military aspects. When the Civil War broke out, he was initially approached by the United States government, as he was a U.S. Army officer. And he was approached by the Union to perhaps lead troops for the federal cause. However, Robert E. Lee was from Virginia. And as such, he was loyal to Virginia, which was a pro slave state, and it would eventually become a Confederate state. Robert E. Lee was not staunchly for the preservation of slavery. Robert E. Lee remained a Confederate loyalist out of loyalty to the state of Virginia, which was a Confederate state. Much consternation is made about statues of old Confederate monuments and war heroes and whatnot. A few years ago, in Dallas, there was the statue of Robert E. Lee, which had come under scrutiny in Lee Plaza in Dallas. It's often seen as an ode to an era bygone, a losing cause, if you will. Why are you erecting statues of people who lost wars and were on the wrong side of history, so to speak? I largely agree with that sentiment. I think, why are we idolizing people who lost a war? Never mind the thing that their side espoused, the preservation of slavery, states' rights, if you will. However, I also want to maybe bring in the question of priority. Because, yes, Robert E. Lee, controversial figure, even though he wasn't for slavery, he did fight for a cause that defended slavery. To remove his statue cost $400,000 in 2017 or 18, whenever that year was. $400,000. The city of Dallas had incurred a massive budget shortfall that year, and their police pension fund and firefighters pension fund was over $1 billion underfunded, and the city of Dallas had mass debt, and they weren't taking care enough of their first responders to actually fund their pensions. But they thought nothing of spending $400,000 to remove a statue out of symbolism. I understand why it was removed. I don't understand why it was prioritized when there were other things that were more directly effectual. So that's something perhaps that maybe you can explore yourself and do something and do your own education or whatnot. Otherwise, in the 1930s, when a lot of these statues were erected, yeah, there was still a pro-Confederate sentiment that pervaded the stateside here in Texas, as Texas was a Confederate state. Otherwise, though, I don't really see a need to idolize Confederates. They lost the war. Had the Confederacy won the war or somehow preserved the Confederacy, yeah, obviously, to the victor goes the spoils. But you didn't win. Okay? We're going to talk about why they didn't win here shortly. But Robert E. Lee was a very effective commander of troops. And even though the Union Army had success out west towards the Mississippi River, they were largely and soundly defeated out east by Lee's forces in places like Virginia. So, Robert E. Lee, of course, trained at the the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, as did Ulysses S. Grant. They would become adversaries who had served in similar capacities and went to similar institutions. So, the social leaders in their communities would oftentimes round up people based upon their leadership ability. Would the troops fight for this person? Initially, Union troops struggled to fight for some of their commanders. Southern troops, Confederates, they had no trouble fighting for the cause. And when they saw a successful leader like Robert E. Lee leading troops, they mounted up even harder. Okay? A lesser known aspect of Civil War history was the aspect of naval capacities. Largely, the United States naval forces. The Union had an overwhelming naval advantage, and it would play a large role in blocking the southern coast, both on the Atlantic side and on the Gulf side. It would also play a large factor in blocking major navigable rivers like the Mississippi River west as well. So, ongoing ships or seafaring ships would block Confederate ports, would seize Confederate ports, would seize Confederate ships or otherwise ships that were meant to supply the Confederate effort. And the Confederates couldn't do a whole lot about it because they didn't really have a navy. One thing that did kind of change, though, was that the Confederates got hold of an old U.S. Navy frigate, the Merrimac, and they were able to the ironclad ship, the Merrimac, was able to wreak havoc on Union wooden ships. Okay, oftentimes out of the port of Norfolk, Virginia, any Union ships that tried to block the Merrimac would get thrashed and spread. So what did the Union naval forces do? They came out with their own ironclad ship, the Monitor, which engaged the Merrimac and basically produced a stalemate. And what that ineffectually did was eliminate any sort of Confederate Navy threat for whatever it was. So from that standpoint, the only defense that the South had against United States naval forces were land-based fixed guns had to be fired from the shores or whatnot, and they were largely ineffectual. So that was a really big advantage for the Union, outside of other advantages as well. Otherwise, though, I mentioned in a prior video in this chapter Great Britain and France, and how many Europeans somewhat favored the Confederacy, even though they didn't really take official sides or anything of the sort. Aristocratic Europeans who were used to trading cotton and producing clothes and other merchants were sympathetic to the Confederate side. They didn't want to take sides. And then not only that, Europeans like the French and British, they didn't want to antagonize the United States, especially if they were continuously winning the war. So they didn't want to take sides. There were folks in England who were staunch anti-slavery supporters, so therefore they were against the Confederacy. The But in reality, because the Europeans didn't take side, they'd have to figure other things out. If the Confederacy could not deliver to them some of their cotton byproduct and cotton products, they'd have to come up with other different things and other different means of economic progress. Okay, the United States government saw the French and British not taking sides as somewhat taking sides. So what I mean by that is, French, British, you are not against slavery. You are not for preservation of the United States. You must you must either be for slavery or you must want to threaten the sovereignty of the United States. There were a lot of bitter emotions by the United States government towards its European powers because they saw neutrality as being non-neutral. So it also, by rendering neutrality status, it rendered both the Confederacy and the Union as having equal stature. The United States government did not want the Confederate States of America to have any sort of international recognition, any of which would be deemed as having sovereignty and relevancy. You can't have that. So the United States was quite upset with the European powers. They just saw this as a domestic insurrection. So instead of it being recognized as a legitimate government, it's just an internal conflict. Okay? That's how the United States government played it. What ultimately hurt the South, though, was since they were unable to get much of their cotton product to Europe, European powers would have to come up with another source to get that cotton. So instead of buying American cotton from the South, they were able to obtain more cotton from Egypt. You wouldn't think a desert country would have a lot of cotton, but in reality, in the Nile River Delta in northern Egypt, you have a massive cotton output. And you have a navigable river in North Africa that is widely available for irrigation. Okay. Egyptian cotton to this day is highly sought after. It's considered to be great quality. So cotton from Egypt and India supplanted the amount of cotton that European powers needed from the American South. That further crippled the Confederacy. So, just another reason why you don't put all your eggs in one cotton basket. Otherwise, though, Great Britain, France, they wanted to stay out of American affairs, but they were watching from a distance with caution.